And we are back on the Morgan Streetman Show, a packed show. Still so much to get to, Morgan. You were talking about the change in narrative that we've seen take place. And if you can continue to expound on that, we'll get into some more things like the 25th Amendment. We've been hearing a lot thrown about whether that's going to be invoked. So still much to get to.
Yeah, well, it was so surprising last week because as of last week, and I don't think people have actually changed their minds. I mean, what we're perceiving here is the media change, the change in narrative of the media and maybe the ruling class, the ruling elites. They've changed their tune dramatically. And I always wonder, was this a setup? Did they in some way, have a sense that this kind of thing could be coming? Because if you remember originally, Mitch McConnell was out there really pressuring the senators not to object to the Electoral College votes. And then all of a sudden, maybe a couple of weeks before the vote, he backed off big time. And he just said, well, you're going to have to do whatever you've got to do. Well, we knew this protest was scheduled for the Capitol. A lot of people say that it was infiltrated by Antifa. And there are some people who think there's a real good reason to believe that, including, a lot of things that they saw, a lot of things that they smelled. Like a lot of burning marijuana, apparently, which would be very unusual for a Trump rally or a Stop the Steal rally, but maybe not so unusual for an Antifa-type rally. And there were some people who reported smelling a lot of that at the Capitol protest, almost like there had been infiltrations. There are people that have reported busloads of apparently Antifa people being bussed in to the protest and that they were dressed like Trump supporters or people in the MAGA movement, and that those were some of the instigators who moved up to the front and who actually sort of led the charge on the Capitol. Now, I think there's no doubt that there were other people who were patriots, who were Trump supporters, who were MAGA people who got swept up in the moment and went inside the Capitol. That's got to have been the case. Hardly anything in life is ever completely absolute. One side or the other. So I'm certain there must have been some Trump supporters who got swept up in the moment and went inside the Capitol. But, who were the instigators, and were they put there to specifically instigate that, what we might call an invasion of the Capitol by the protesters? And then look at how quickly the narrative changed, because that invasion of the Capitol occurred right around the time that the vote was supposed to be going on to either certify or not certify the Electoral College votes, the votes of the electors by the Congress. And people had hoped that Vice President Mike Pence was going to do something about that, maybe kick it back to the state legislatures, many of whom, or some of whom at least, particularly in Pennsylvania and Arizona, had written to Congress, to Vice President Pence, and asked them to give them an opportunity to come back to the state legislatures and decertify the electors that they'd previously certified and look into this some more. We know Senator Ted Cruz was talking about a 10-day commission to sort of audit the election. And ahead of time, I was sort of dubious about whether that could possibly work given the time frame. But, at least there was talk about it. But then you had this sort of mass of people rushing into the Capitol. They shut down the Capitol. The lawmakers were apparently freaking out about it, and they all went away for a little while. And then they came back later in the evening after they had secured the Capitol. But the narrative had totally changed. Now it was all about this incitement to a riot, to a mob. Forget about whether or not the election was secure, whether or not there was interference, whether or not there was massive fraud on such a massive scale that it affected the outcome of the election. None of that could be talked about anymore, because now the only issue that mattered for a lot of the congressmen and senators was they had to be on record opposing this, what they were calling an insurrection or a riot that occurred at the Capitol. And we saw senators who just a couple of days before, like Senator Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, who possibly could have imagined that she would turn into a sellout, or James Lankford. I mean, you could have predicted that these people didn't really mean what they said when they said they were going to object to the electors and would find some reason. And then lo and behold, she gave a speech, based on what she'd seen at the Capitol that day. She could no longer in good conscience vote to contest the election. And we now see that even those who exercise their lawful authority as our representatives to try to challenge this, who did nothing illegal. And we're talking about people like Mo Brooks, who challenged the electors. We're talking about Louis Gohmert, who has filed lawsuits and has challenged the electors also. They're talking about Matt Gaetz, who was challenging the electors, who gave a floor speech about this. They're now saying we need to punish those people. We want to get them even out of Congress, maybe. At a minimum, we want to censure them or, have an official criticism of their conduct. But, there's also talk about they ought to be removed. And, of course, they had previous to the incident on Capitol Hill, they had talked about not even some representatives had talked about they should not even be seated in this Congress because of their viewpoints on the election. So the answer is you're not even allowed to question the election. You're not allowed to look into it. There may have been fraud that was so obvious it's just staring you in the face on a massive scale. And there's so many ways, and we've talked about them on the show, so many ways to look at it and see the fraud, so many indicators, so many red flags. But you're not even allowed to look into it, or else they're going to try to cancel you. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.